Well, good afternoon, and thanks so much for participating in this class about memory, how it works, and how to improve it. My name's Thad Polk. I'm a professor of psychology at the University of Michigan, and I'm delighted to be with you this afternoon. Well, have you heard the joke about the two older couples who go out to dinner together? One of the men says to the other man, "Last week I went to this terrific memory seminar. They taught me all kinds of techniques and strategies to help me keep my memory sharp as I get older. You should check it out." So his friend says, "Man, that sounds interesting. What was the name of the seminar?" The first guy thinks for a minute. "Oh, yeah. What's the name of that flower that has thorns and smells good? A rose? That's it." Then he turns to his wife. "Hey, Rose, what was the name of that memory seminar that I went to last week?" Now, I think most of us can probably relate to that joke. We've all had the experience of misplacing our phone or our keys and not being able to remember where we put them. Or maybe it's forgetting someone's name or the name of a book that we read or a movie that we saw. Well, those kinds of memory lapses also tend to get a little bit more frequent as we get older. And many people naturally wonder whether such mental lapses indicate the beginnings of dementia. But I'm happy to report that they usually don't. For example, most people will occasionally have trouble remembering a common word, like toothbrush, and that usually doesn't indicate a problem. It's when you start forgetting what a toothbrush is for that you might want to check with your doctor. But even if occasional memory lapses are normal and nothing to worry about, most people would still like to understand how their memory works and how they might improve it. And that's what I want to talk about today. But before we get started, I thought we could do a little demonstration that illustrates some important ideas about memory. So what I'd like you to do is to try to remember a bunch of sentences that I'm going to read out loud. Now, don't write them down. That would be cheating. I'm going to give you quite a few sentences, so there's no way that you can store them all in your working memory. You'll just have to try to store them away in your long-term memory. Then afterwards, we'll see what you remember. Okay, ready? Here we go. The warm breeze stirred the air. The rock crushed the tiny hut at the edge of the woods. The ants ate the sweet jelly. The man read the story. The rock which rolled down the mountain crushed the tiny hut. The warm breeze blowing from the sea stirred the air. The ants in the kitchen ate the jelly. The rock crushed the tiny hut. The breeze stirred the air. The ants in the kitchen ate the jelly which was on the table. John was trying to fix the birdhouse. He was pounding a nail when his father came out to watch him and help him do the work. The ants ate the sweet jelly which was on the table. The rock which rolled down the mountain crushed the hut. The warm breeze stirred the heavy evening air. The breeze was blowing from the sea. The man resting on the couch read the story in the newspaper. Okay, that's it. We'll come back a little bit later and see what you remember. But now, let's talk about how memory works. And I'd like to begin by telling you about a man who may have taught us more about memory and its neural substrates than anyone in history. His name was Henry Molaison. Now, Henry wasn't a famous psychologist or neuroscientist. He didn't design a critical experiment or write any influential articles or books. In fact, he wasn't a scientist at all. He was a neurological patient who suffered from profound amnesia. But studies of Henry, or patient HM as he's known in the scientific literature, have radically changed our understanding of how memory works and how it's implemented in the brain. Well, Henry was born in 1926, and he grew up near Hartford, Connecticut. And when he was around 7 years old, he was run over by a bicycle. He hit his head, and he was unconscious for a few minutes. And later on, he started experiencing epileptic seizures. Now, at first, the seizures were manageable, but they grew worse and worse over time. When he was a senior in high school, his seizures were so bad that his high school principal asked him not to walk across the stage for graduation. out of fear that he might have a seizure on stage. By the time he was 27, he was having about 10 seizures a day, and large doses of anticonvulsant medication weren't helping. He was therefore desperate to find an alternative treatment. And that's when a renowned neurosurgeon named William Scoville suggested that surgery might be worth a try. Now, surgery might seem like a strange way to treat epilepsy, but it can often be effective when medications don't work. So think of epilepsy like a kind of electrical storm that spreads through the brain, ultimately leading to a seizure. Well, in many patients, the storm starts in a specific region of the brain. And if you can figure out where the storm is starting and surgically remove that brain region, then it can often eliminate the seizures, or at least significantly reduce them. The doctors therefore put electrodes on Henry's scalp, recorded his brain waves, and waited for a seizure in the hopes that they would be able to isolate the source. And sure enough, they found some brainwave abnormalities in the temporal lobes during one of his seizures. And based on these findings, they decided to perform an experimental surgery and remove some parts of his temporal lobes in the hope that doing so would help control his seizures. And it did. After the surgery, Henry only had about 5 minor seizures a month. But unfortunately, he also suffered a very serious side effect. He became profoundly amnesic. And as a result, that surgery has never been performed again. Here's a quote from Henry himself describing what it was like for him after the surgery. "Right now, I'm wondering, have I done or said anything amiss? You see, at this moment, everything looks unclear to me. But what happened just before, that's what worries me. It's like waking from a dream I just don't remember. Every day is alone in itself, whatever enjoyment I've had and whatever sorrow I've had." Now, obviously, Henry's case was absolutely tragic, but Henry himself was very generous, and he decided to try to help advance our understanding of memory by volunteering for countless experiments for decades. In fact, it's quite likely that Henry was tested more than any other neurological patient in history. And those studies taught us a lot of what we know about how memory works. Now, one of the first things that scientists discovered was that Henry had problems remembering events that occurred before the surgery. In particular, he remembered almost no events from the 2 years preceding the surgery, and his memory for the 9 years before that was also impaired. Now, this kind of memory impairment is typically called retrograde amnesia. The term retrograde simply refers to when the forgotten events occurred. So in retrograde amnesia, the forgotten events occurred before the brain damage. But it turns out Henry's most significant deficit was actually in remembering new information that he encountered after his surgery. For example, he was unable to remember the names and faces of the doctors and nurses who took care of him every day. In fact, he typically didn't even recognize them. And so they would have to introduce themselves day after day, despite working with him for years. He could spend hours with a person, engaging in detailed conversations, participating in scientific tests, or sharing a meal. But 5 minutes after their departure, he would typically have no memory for the person or the encounter. And if they came back to visit, Henry would introduce himself and act as if he had never met them before, because as far as he was concerned, he hadn't. Now, this kind of impairment in laying down new memories is often called anterograde amnesia. So in anterograde amnesia, the forgotten events occurred after the brain injury, whereas in retrograde amnesia, the forgotten events occurred before. For example, after his operation in 1953, Henry lived with his parents. His father died in 1967, and his mother died in 1981. And Henry then lived in a nursing home. But years later, when asked where he lived, he would typically say that he lived in a house with his mother. And when asked if his father was still alive, he would often say that he wasn't sure, even though his father had died over 20 years earlier. He would sometimes write himself a note as a reminder of his dad's death in an attempt to avoid forgetting this intensely personal memory. Okay, well, so far we focused on Henry's deficits, but it turns out that many other aspects of learning and memory were actually preserved in Henry. And it was the specific pattern of spared versus impaired functions that taught scientists the most about human memory. So next, let's turn to what Henry could still do, and in particular, what he could still learn. And one of the most important findings was that Henry could still learn skills. For example, you remember how to tie your shoe and how to ride a bike. And you can also learn new skills like playing a new instrument or learning to play golf. And that was also true of Henry. Despite his profound deficit in learning and remembering conscious memories, he could still learn new skills and remember how to perform them. And so can other amnesic patients. For example, in one famous experiment, amnesics were asked to read mirror reversed text, like you see at the top of this slide. Now, this is challenging, but if you practice, you'll get better and better over time. And it turns out that amnesics also improve at reading mirror reversed text the more they practice. So this graph shows how reading time improves with additional practice. The white circles are normal control subjects, and the black circles are amnesics. And as you can see, the amnesics learn just as quickly as normal control subjects do. Furthermore, they were still good at it 3 months later. So not only do amnesics learn to perform this skill, they also retain this newly acquired ability. But what's amazing is that even though the amnesics get better and better at mirror reading, they typically have no conscious memory of ever having done the task before. So the bottom line is that amnesics can learn perceptual and motor skills just like everyone else. Although they may not consciously remember ever having performed the tasks before, their performance continues to improve with additional practice. Another way of putting it is in terms of remembering how versus remembering that. So amnesics can learn and remember how to perform a skill, even when they don't remember that they ever practiced it before. Now, these kinds of results radically changed our understanding of memory and how it's implemented in the brain. At the most general level, they conclusively demonstrate that human beings use multiple different memory systems, depending on what they're learning. In particular, remembering procedural skills is fundamentally different than remembering conscious information, and it even depends on different parts of the brain. After all, amnesia clearly shows that brain damage that dramatically impairs conscious memory can leave skill memory intact. Now, psychologists often refer to conscious memories as declarative, and they refer to skill memory as procedural. So declarative memories are memories that you can consciously bring to mind and describe verbally. They're called declarative because you can declare them or verbalize them. Now, when most people think of learning and memory, they're thinking of declarative memory, remembering what you ate for lunch, where you went on your last vacation, and what 2 plus 2 is. Those are all examples of declarative memories. Most of the learning that you do when listening to this lecture is also declarative. You can consciously bring the information that you learned to mind, and you can describe it verbally. These are the kinds of memories that amnesics have difficulty learning and remembering. Now, in contrast, procedural memories are memories for motor and cognitive skills. Think of your memory for how to ride a bike or how to tie your shoe. Once you've learned to tie your shoe, you really don't have to think about how to do it. When you put on a tennis shoe, your mind and body take over. You can think about other things or hold a conversation while you're tying your shoe. It's an automatic procedural memory. Now, the take-home message is simple, but it's important. Remembering declarative information is fundamentally different than remembering procedural skills. The two types of memory depend on completely different cognitive and neural mechanisms. Now, let's turn to another important characteristic of memory, namely that your memory is constructive. Now, many people have the mistaken idea that their memory is kind of like a video recording. They think that as you go about your day, your memory system is constantly recording all your experiences. And then when you want to remember something, you just rewind and play back what you experienced. But the truth is that we typically only remember bits and pieces of what we experienced. And when we try to retrieve information from memory, we fill in the missing information with plausible inferences. That's what I mean when I say that memory is constructive. We build our memories by combining information that we actually experienced with plausible information that we add in. Unfortunately, we typically can't tell the difference between what we actually experienced and what we filled in. To illustrate the idea, let's return to those sentences that I read to you at the beginning. I think you might be surprised at what you remember. Now, what I'm going to do is read a few of those sentences. Well, actually, I'm going to read a few candidate sentences, and I want you to decide if you think each sentence is one that I read earlier or not, okay? Okay, so here's sentence number 1. The ants in the kitchen ate the sweet jelly which was on the table. So decide if you think I've read that sentence before, okay? It's number 2. The breeze blowing from the sea stirred the heavy evening air. How about that one? Do you think I read that sentence before? How about sentence number 3? The man read the story in the newspaper. And finally, sentence 4, the breeze stirred the air. Do you think that was one of the sentences that I read at the beginning? Okay, let's see how you did. Which of those 4 sentences do you think came from the original list? Well, it turns out that the last one did, but not the first 3. Now, many of you probably thought I had read some of those earlier sentences, but I actually didn't. Only the last sentence was old. All the others were new. And some of you may have thought that I hadn't said the last sentence, even though I did. Now, these materials were from a real experiment that was conducted at the University of Minnesota. They started with 4 relatively complicated sentences, like, the ants in the kitchen ate the sweet jelly which was on the table. They then used these complicated sentences to make up simpler sentences that conveyed one or more of the key ideas from the original. For example, from the complicated sentence up here, they created simpler sentences like, the ants were in the kitchen and the sweet jelly was on the table. Now, these sentences conveyed some of the ideas from the original sentence, but not all of them. And they also varied how many ideas from the original sentence these simpler sentences conveyed. For example, the sentence, the ants were in the kitchen, basically conveys a single idea, while the sentence, the sweet jelly was on the table, conveys 2, namely that the jelly was sweet and that it was on the table. Now, they presented 24 of these sentences to people, and they tested their memory for them about 5 minutes later. Some of the sentences really had been in the original list, but others had not. And then the subjects were asked to give a rating indicating how confident they were that each sentence was from the original list. Now, you would hope that people would give higher confidence ratings for sentences that were actually old compared with sentences that were new, indicating that they remembered them, right? Wrong. In fact, people gave almost exactly the same ratings for new sentences as they did for old sentences. Essentially, they had almost no idea which sentences were new and which sentences were old. So, does that mean that they didn't remember anything? Not at all. But what they remembered was the ideas from the original sentences, not the exact wording. For example, the confidence ratings increased systematically the more ideas were included. People gave higher ratings to test sentences that conveyed 4 ideas from the original sentences, and they tended to give negative ratings for test sentences that only conveyed a single idea. And that was true whether the test sentence was new or old. And you may have experienced the same thing. I mean, many people think that they remember the earlier sentences that I read, but not the last sentence. Well, it turns out that the last sentence only conveyed a single idea. That last sentence was, "The breeze stirred the air." That idea was certainly included in the original list that I read, but it's only a single isolated idea. Now compare that to the first test sentence, which was, "The ants in the kitchen ate the sweet jelly which was on the table." Now that sentence conveys 4 ideas. The ants were in the kitchen, the ants ate the jelly was sweet, and the jelly was on the table. So even though that sentence wasn't actually on the original list, it conveys a lot more of the ideas from the original list. And so naturally, it seems like a better match. Now, there were also a couple of other sentences in the list that I haven't tested yet, but let's test those sentences in a different way. So here are 4 different sentences, and I read one of these sentences to you earlier, but I didn't read the other 3. So sentence 1, he was using a hammer when his father came out to watch him. Sentence 2, he was using a hammer when his mother came out to watch him. Sentence 3, he was screwing in a screw when his father came out to watch him. And finally, sentence 4, he was pounding a nail when his father came out to watch him. Now, which of those 4 sentences do you think I actually said? I suspect that most of you weren't fooled by sentence 2, saying that his mother came out to watch. You may have remembered that it was his father that came out, not his mother. So saying that his mother came out is a change in meaning. And as we've seen, we're pretty good at remembering gist or meaning. Likewise, I doubt that many of you picked sentence 3, saying that he was screwing in a screw. That's also a different meaning, and people are pretty good at ruling that one out. But what about the first sentence? He was using a hammer when his father came out to watch him. I suspect that one was a little harder to reject, and many of you may have actually thought it was the one that I had really said, but it wasn't. Sentence 4 is the original. And notice, it never said anything about a hammer. It said he was pounding a nail. Now, it's obviously pretty likely that he was using a hammer to pound the nail, but that's actually an inference. I mean, it's possible that John was using his shoe to pound the nail. There's nothing in the original sentence to rule that out. So, what can we learn from this example? Well, as we've already discussed, we tend to remember gist or meaning rather than verbatim wording. But it goes beyond that. When we encounter new information, we tend to build up a mental model of what's going on in the situation. In the case of John fixing the birdhouse, we imagine a specific guy working on a specific birdhouse. And constructing such a mental model means filling in some of the details that weren't specified. For example, when we hear that he's pounding a nail, we tend to imagine John with a hammer in his hand, since that's the standard tool that we use to pound nails. And it's that mental model that we learn and remember, rather than the original sentences, or even just the gist of the original sentences. In fact, in a real experiment using these materials, participants were actually more likely to pick sentence 1 with the hammer compared to sentence 4 about pounding nails. And presumably, that's because they remembered a mental model of the situation, and in that mental model, John was using a hammer. Now, these findings actually have some important real-world implications. Specifically, our legal system often relies on the testimony of eyewitnesses. So a natural question is, just how reliable is eyewitness testimony? Well, let me tell you about some research that has explored that question. Here's a simple experimental paradigm in which participants first encode some event. Maybe they watch a video of something like a car accident or a robbery. So they are now an eyewitness. And their memory for that event will subsequently be tested. But before that happens, they may or may not receive some misinformation, some subtle information that could potentially distort their memory for the original event. Some people get misinformed while other people don't. Then everybody's memory gets tested, and you see whether the people who were misinformed exhibit memory distortions relative to the people who weren't misinformed. Now, in one of the first experiments like this, people watched a videotape of a car accident in which two cars collide. The two groups are then asked a question about the video. The control group is asked, how fast do you think those cars were going when they hit each other? The misled group is asked a very similar question with just a minor tweak. How fast do you think those cars were going when they smashed into each other? Now, I think you'll agree that using the phrase smashed into each other suggests that it may have been a more violent collision, while the phrase hit each other doesn't have the same strong connotation of a violent collision. But that's the only difference between the two groups. Then, everyone from both groups is asked the same test question. Did you see broken glass in the video? Now, in reality, there was no broken glass. So the correct answer would be no. So what did they find? Well, about 14% of the control subjects misremembered seeing broken glass. But in contrast, 32% of the subjects in the misled group made the error. And what was the difference between the two groups? The control group was asked, how fast were the cars when they hit each other, while the misled group was asked, how fast were they going when they smashed into each other? Hit versus smashed. That's the only difference between the groups. And yet that one small change more than doubled the probability of a false memory for broken glass. So this study demonstrates that some relatively subtle, suggestive information can have a dramatic influence on somebody's memory for an event that they actually witnessed. Okay, well, so far we've focused on a few key insights into how our memories work. But I suspect most of you are even more interested in learning if there's anything we can do to improve our memories. And I'm happy to report that there is. And I'd like to spend the rest of the lecture addressing that question. And I'd like to do so from two angles. First, what strategies are most effective during learning itself? And second, what lifestyle changes have been associated with better learning and memory? Let's start with strategies to use during learning itself. And I'd like to give you an acronym that summarizes 3 key memory strategies that have actually been scientifically demonstrated to be effective. The acronym is STAR, which stands for Space, Test, and Randomize. Let's start by talking about spacing. Now, if you're in the audience today, then you're obviously interested in learning new things. And I suspect that extends to other areas of your life. Maybe you want to learn the basics of a foreign language so that you can communicate with people who speak that language. Or maybe you're trying to master a new hobby like golf or quilting or playing the violin. Well, if you want to maximize how much you learn and remember, then it turns out that you're much better off spacing your practice over time rather than cramming most of your practice into a few marathon study sessions. Psychologists refer to this as distributed practice, and it means spreading out your study over time with breaks or lags between study sessions. For example, here's a study that investigated different approaches to trying to learn a foreign language. So subjects in the study tried to learn the English translations of a bunch of Spanish words. Everyone studied the words during 6 half-hour sessions, but the researchers varied the lag or spacing between the study sessions. So group number 1 up here had all 6 sessions back-to-back on the same day. For group number 2, the 6 study sessions were all 1 day apart. And for group number 3, the study sessions were each a full month apart. Now, as you would expect, the people who took a month-long break between each study session forgot the meaning of a lot of the Spanish words that they had studied, and they had to relearn them. And so their performance during the practice sessions was the worst of the three groups. So they're the people in purple in the bottom of this graph. Now, in contrast, the people who had all 6 sessions back to back on the same day obviously didn't forget much from one session to the next. And they're the people in green at the top here. And as you can see, by the 3rd session, they had pretty much mastered the translations. And their performance didn't really change much in sessions 4, 5, and 6. But what's interesting is how well the different groups remembered the information after a delay. So everyone came back 30 days after their last practice session and took a test to see how much they remembered. Now the group that crammed all their study into a single day did the worst. They're the green dot down here at the bottom. They remembered about 68% of the Spanish word translations, so about 2/3. The group that had study sessions separated by a day are the pink dot here, and they remembered 86% of the translations, an improvement of almost 20%. And the purple dot up here is the group that studied once a month. They remembered a full 95% of the translations. Now, clearly, spacing study over time leads to stronger and longer lasting memory than cramming. And that's an important lesson for us. For example, if you're trying to learn a foreign language like Spanish or French, you'd be much better off spacing out your practice over time rather than cramming it into a short period of time. And spacing out your study is also helpful if you're trying to learn a new skill, like golf or playing the piano. For example, here's a study that demonstrated the advantages of spaced training for surgeons. So 38 surgical residents received 4 training sessions on a specific type of microscopic surgery that required connecting very small blood vessels together. Half the residents received all the training in one day, which was the standard approach used in the residency program. But the other half of the residents received 1 training session each week for 4 weeks. So both groups received the same amount of training, but one group's training was spaced while the other group's training was not. Now, 1 month after the final training session, all the residents were asked to perform the surgery on a live rat, while experts who didn't know about the experiment observed. And the residents whose training was spaced performed much better. They all completed the surgery successfully, while some of the residents in the other group didn't. Furthermore, their surgically repaired blood vessels were more stable, and the experts rated their performance as being significantly better. So why would spacing the training help? Well, there's a couple of potential reasons. One idea is that people are more engaged and attentive after a delay. I mean, if you've just spent the past 2 hours practicing your golf putting, it might be tough to remain focused for another hour of the same kind of practice. But if you take a break and space your practice, then you can often return more energized and be more productive in your 3rd hour. Another reason spacing might help is that practicing a skill at different times can make it less dependent on any specific practice context. For example, suppose you're hitting golf balls, and in one practice session, the wind is blowing into your face. So hitting the ball lower leads to better results because it keeps the ball below the wind. But then, suppose you take a break, you come back the next day, now the wind is with you. Now hitting the ball higher might lead to better results because the ball can ride the wind. So in this case, spacing your practice helped you learn to hit shots in 2 different types of conditions, both of which you're going to encounter when playing real rounds of golf. So the bottom line for us is that we should space our practice to maximize learning and memory. Now let's turn to the T in the STAR acronym, which stands for testing. Now, when most people think of testing, they think of school and they think of grades. And I suspect many members of this audience are delighted that the days of tests and exams are behind them. But I'd like to try to convince you that testing yourself is actually one of the single most effective ways to learn. Now, by now, the benefits of testing have been shown in hundreds of studies. But let me tell you about one that was done at Washington University in St. Louis, just to give you a feel for what these studies are like. So people were asked to study a few text passages like you might find in Wikipedia or an encyclopedia. For example, maybe they read some articles about Peruvian history and some other articles about Italian history. Then the subjects restudied half of the passages and they took a test on the other half of the passages. So let's say they restudied the articles about Italy, but they got tested on the articles about Peru. Now, a week later, they came back and took a test that assessed how much they had learned from all the passages. Here are the results. The pink bars show memory performance on passages that they had been tested on, and the green bars show performance on passages that they had restudied. And across 3 different experiments, people consistently remembered much more about the passages on which they had been tested compared with the passages that they had restudied. And that wasn't just true for fact-based questions either. Testing also led to improved performance on more conceptual, inference-based questions. And keep in mind that being tested on a passage meant that the subjects didn't get to restudy it. So they had actually studied those passages for less time than the other passages. And yet they learned more from being tested than they did from restudying. And that's also a very valuable lesson for us. So rather than rereading something you've already read or listening to something over again that you've already heard, you'd be much better off asking a family member or a friend to ask you questions about the material that you're trying to remember. Another powerful strategy is creating flashcards that have questions on one side with answers on the other. For example, you could write Spanish words on one side and their English translations on the other side. And then you could repeatedly test yourself on the material until you've really mastered it. Okay, so we've seen that spacing out your study over time can help you remember information better, and so can repeatedly testing yourself to see if you can retrieve it. Now let's turn to the R in STAR, which stands for randomizing when you're trying to learn. Now, most complex skills involve multiple parts, each of which must be mastered. For example, golf requires learning to hit tee shots, iron shots, chip shots, pitch shots, sand shots, putts. Likewise, tennis requires hitting forehands, backhands, serves, volleys, overheads. So what is the best way to practice? Should you go to the driving range and hit 100 tee shots in a row? Or would you be better off hitting a tee shot and then hitting a 7-iron and then hitting a pitching wedge, randomly intermixing different shots one after another? When you're practicing tennis, should you hit cross-court forehand after cross-court forehand until you get into a groove? Or should you randomly intermix forehands with backhands and volleys and overheads? And although many people find it counterintuitive, it turns out that randomizing your practice leads to much better skill learning. Here's a study that illustrates what I mean. 2 groups of people practiced tossing beanbags at a target. Group 1, which we'll call the fixed group, repeatedly tossed the beanbags to the same target, which was a fixed distance away. Group 2, which we'll call the random group, tossed beanbags to targets that varied in distance. So they never got into a groove. And they never practiced on the target that the fixed group used. Now, after training, both groups of subjects tossed beanbags at the target that the fixed group had practiced on repeatedly. And as incredible as it sounds, the random group, who had practiced at varying distances, actually performed better than the fixed group, who had repeatedly practiced with the target that was used for the test. And remember, the random group never practiced with that target, while the fixed group always did. So clearly, randomizing your practice can be a very powerful approach when trying to learn a procedural skill. Now, one potential explanation for why randomizing is helpful is that when you actually have to perform the real skill later on, you'll typically have to perform all the subparts in an unpredictable order. So using random practice better prepares you for the real execution of the skill. For example, when playing in a real tennis match, you'll be forced to intermix forehands and backhands in an unpredictable order. And it turns out that it's better to practice that way too. As athletes often say, you should practice the way you play. And the implications for you and me as we try to learn new skills should be pretty clear. We should mix up our practice rather than working on an isolated part of the skill for an extended period of time. The tennis player should consider intermixing forehands and backhands during practice. The golfer might want to switch clubs after every shot or two when practicing at the driving range. Likewise, the musician might want to practice different pieces during each practice session rather than just focusing on one. Okay, so there's 3 strategies that have been proven to be effective in helping us remember information that we're trying to learn. Space your learning over time, test yourself repeatedly, and randomize or interleave your practice. Okay, I'd like to finish up today by talking about a few lifestyle changes that have been demonstrated to help improve our memory and help us to age a little more gracefully. Now, there's an old joke about how people define success at different points in their life. At age 4, success is not peeing in your pants. At age 12, success is having friends. At age 16, success is having a driver's license. At age 20, success is having sex. At age 35, success is having money. Then, at age 50, success is having money. At age 60, success is having sex. At age 70, success is having a driver's license, and so on. Now, most of us can appreciate that joke, but we'd also like to age a little more gracefully than that. So how can we do that? Well, let's discuss 3 lifestyle changes that have been shown to be effective: sleep, eating right, and staying active. And these can also be remembered by an acronym, SEA or SEA. So let's start with sleep. Now, sleep is one of the most primitive and ubiquitous behavioral functions. All animals do it, from fish to dogs to elephants. We human beings spend roughly 1/3 of our lives sleeping. So think about that. That means that a 60-year-old has spent about 20 years asleep. But why? Why do we sleep? I mean, many people view sleep as an annoyance and a waste of time. They get up before the sun and they stay up long after it has set. They use caffeine and other stimulants to stay awake longer and circumvent their body's signals telling them to sleep. But the truth is, we can't function as well when we don't get enough sleep. Our ability to think clearly, to react quickly, and to focus our attention all decline when we're sleep deprived. In fact, sleep deprivation has been implicated in a number of major tragedies, including the Space Shuttle Challenger explosion, the Exxon Valdez oil spill, and maybe even the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. And in addition to sleep's role in helping us to be alert and focused, there's now a great deal of evidence that sleep plays a crucial role in memory. And that's what I want to talk about now. So one famous experiment tested memory ability in 77 people before and after a sleep intervention. First, everyone took a digit span test that measures how many random numbers you can remember at one time. Then everyone was randomly assigned to one of 3 groups. One group slept an hour more than they normally did for 3 consecutive days. A second group slept an hour less than they normally did on each of those days. And the final control group slept their normal amount. Then all 3 groups were tested on the digit span test again. Now, as you might imagine, the control group's performance didn't change much. On average, they were able to repeat back about 5.2 digits both before and after the 3-day sleep intervention. But the group that slept for an hour less than normal for 3 nights in a row got worse. They were able to repeat back about half a digit less after the sleep deprivation compared to before. And perhaps most interesting of all, the group who got an extra hour of sleep actually improved by about the same amount, suggesting that they probably weren't getting as much sleep as they needed to begin with. And similar findings have been reported in college students. In fact, one study of college freshmen found that good sleep habits were the best predictor of GPA, better than any other variable they considered, including exercise, diet, mood, stress, social support, and religious habits. Now, these studies confirm what many people probably suspected. Learning and memory are better after a good night's sleep. And that makes sense. I mean, after all, a lot of things are better after a good night's rest. You're more alert and you're better at paying attention. So it's not that surprising that your learning and memory performance would be better as well. But what if I were to tell you that you also learn and remember information better before a good night's rest? It's true. If you study some information and then sleep on it, the sleep itself often strengthens and consolidates your memory so that you'll be able to remember it better in the future. For example, here's a study in which people tried to remember a bunch of random word pairs, and half the participants slept for 3 hours after learning, while the other half stayed awake. Then both groups' memory was tested. And the scientists found that sleeping after learning improved memory significantly compared with staying awake. So we've established that sleep is critically important. Here's a few tips just to help you get better sleep. Number 1, try to go to bed a little bit earlier. Number 2, avoid caffeine, nicotine, and alcohol before bed. Number 3, make your bedroom an oasis. Number 4, try to establish a standard bedroom routine. And number 5, get some exercise. That can really help you sleep better. Okay, now let's turn to the E in C, which stands for eating right. Now, most people realize that their diet has a big impact on their health, including their brain health. But which diet? There are so many dietary suggestions out there that it can be quite confusing. Well, it turns out that there's one particular diet that now has quite a bit of research demonstrating its benefits on the brain and on memory, and that's the so-called Mediterranean diet. So the Mediterranean diet is based on what people who grew up around the Mediterranean Sea in the 1950s used to eat. So these people were found to live longer, healthier lives than most other people around the world. And so scientists began investigating why. And one plausible hypothesis is that their diet played a big role. Now, the Mediterranean diet consists of a lot of fruits and vegetables, a lot of olive oil, moderate amounts of alcohol, whole grains, and a lot of fish, nuts, and legumes. And I should point out that this is what the people in the Mediterranean used to eat back in the 1950s. Today, not so much. Now, one famous study assigned over 7,000 people to eat one of 3 diets. 2 groups ate a Mediterranean diet that had been supplemented either with extra virgin olive oil or with nuts, and a 3rd group ate a standard low-fat diet that many cardiologists at the time recommended, but it wasn't a Mediterranean diet. And this study found that eating a Mediterranean diet improved cognitive functions like memory. Specifically, all the participants were given a battery of cognitive tests before and after the experiment. And the scientists found that the people eating the control diet were a little bit worse over time on tests of memory and executive function. And that's consistent with the memory declines that typically accompany aging. But amazingly enough, the participants eating the Mediterranean diet didn't decline. In fact, their scores got better. And other studies have found that eating a Mediterranean diet also reduces your risk of developing Alzheimer's disease, maybe by as much as 50%. So eating better can make a real difference. Finally, let's turn to the A in C, which stands for staying active. Now, researchers at the University of Illinois conducted one of the most famous studies on this topic. They recruited 120 older people and randomly assigned half of them to 1 year of aerobic exercise. And the other half did stretching and toning, but not aerobic exercise. And both groups had brain scans and memory tests before and after the 1 year intervention. Now, this plot shows the size of a part of the brain called the hippocampus that's critically important for long-term memory. This was one of the areas that was removed in Henry Molaison's surgery. Now, normally the hippocampus shrinks as we get older, and sure enough, in the control group, you can see the hippocampus gets a little bit smaller. This is true in both the left hippocampus, the dashed line, and the right hippocampus, the solid line. But surprisingly, the other group, the hippocampus got larger. So in 1 year of aerobic exercise actually led to increases in the size of the hippocampus. And furthermore, these changes in the size of the hippocampus were associated with changes in memory performance. The bottom line is that staying active has benefits for memory in addition to its benefits to our physical health. Now, you can remember these take-home points with the two acronyms, STAR and C. So if you take nothing else out of this lecture, remember that little C star. Okay, I hope this lecture has given you some insight into how the amazing memory systems in your brain work, and also what you can do to make the most of them. Although occasional memory lapses are normal as we age, there are some concrete steps that you can take to optimize your memory function as you age. I hope you'll try them out and that they're helpful. Well, thanks so much for your attention, and I'm happy to respond to questions during the Q&A period. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for watching the lecture, and I'm happy to respond to questions now. I've got a list here of a few questions that I thought I'd start with, and as others come in, I'll try to respond to those as well. So question number one, are there specific areas of the brain that are compromised as we age? That's a great question, and the answer is yes. In particular, I'd like to highlight 3 brain regions that seem to be most susceptible to age. First is the hippocampus. So I actually mentioned this in the lecture itself, that typically as we get older, our hippocampus gets a little bit smaller. And the hippocampus, that's the region that was critically involved in long-term memory. It was removed in patient HM and was associated with profound amnesia. So perhaps it's not that surprising that one of the key functions that often declines as we get older is our so-called episodic memory. Our long-term memory for personal episodes isn't quite as good. And I want to add the caveat that there are substantial individual differences. So although on average, episodic memory might decline with age, that's not true for everyone. Question 2, are there supplements, vitamins, or certain foods that help with brain function, in particular with memory? That's also a terrific and very important question because, as you undoubtedly know, there are many products on the market that claim to help your brain function and your memory. What I'll say is that the verdict is out on the vast majority of those. We don't have the same kind of solid empirical evidence for dietary supplements as we have for things like the Mediterranean diet. So in particular, a number of studies have actually tried to test experimentally whether adding a specific dietary supplement would help memory. And I have to say that in general, the results are disappointing. So it seems to be somehow that eating the diet as a whole is what helps the most. And I have a personal hypothesis about that, which is that it may be that it's not so much that the diet is great, it's just that when we eat, say, a Mediterranean diet, we don't eat all the things that are terrible for us, right? So we don't eat tons of red meat and processed carbohydrates and so on. So that's my own personal hypothesis. Okay. Another question, is there such a thing as muscle memory? If so, does it fall strictly into procedural memory? Right. So, yeah, muscle memory, what most people mean by muscle memory would be what psychologists refer to as procedural memory. And I think the reason that psychologists prefer the term procedural memory is because the memory is not in the muscles, right? The memory is in your brain. And although it's associated with motor skills, it really is a neural memory, not a muscle memory. Okay. For memory tests, are there differences in age and gender in terms of how people perform? Um, Terrific question. So, yes, in particular, although I will say that this is actually a somewhat controversial topic at the moment. So, there were some early, very influential studies that provided some evidence that women tend to be better at verbal tasks and men tend to be better at spatial tasks. And I think overall, that's probably true to some extent, although I think the effect is rather small. And it's also an average effect, right? So there's certainly plenty of women who are great at spatial processing, and there's plenty of men who are great at verbal processing. So although there might be an overall average difference between men and women, it's not particularly large. Now, what about age? Does it interact with age? For example, maybe as we get older, do gender differences get larger or do they get smaller? And as far as I know, that question actually hasn't been answered yet. So I think it's a potential topic for future research. Another question. Do you have a specific amount of aerobic exercise that we should do each day? Well, let's see. What I will say is that anything is good. So there are plenty of studies where people who were relatively sedentary just started walking, even 5 to 10 minutes a day, and it made a difference. So a little bit is better than nothing. On the other hand, you probably also don't need, to be working out 3 hours a day in order to get these benefits. So I believe in the study that I talked about, where they had randomly assigned something like 60 older adults to an aerobic exercise condition. They walked a mile for, and it was 3 to 5 days a week, something like that. So, and they showed substantial benefits. So I don't think I have a great answer on exactly how to titrate it, but doing something is the important thing, and you'll definitely get benefits even from a little bit. Does eating sweets interfere with memory? Yeah, that goes back to my own personal hypothesis about why dietary supplements might not be as effective as the whole dietary change. So as I mentioned, my personal bet is that one of the reasons that the Mediterranean diet studies show such substantial benefits is that those people aren't eating what a lot of people in the Western Hemisphere are eating, right? They're not eating junk food. They're not eating sweets all the time and so on. So, and I do think there's, I suspect that many of the benefits of those diets come from not eating the junk food quite as much. Okay, last question. Let's see. Is there any evidence that games and puzzles help memory? That's another great one and a controversial topic. So, as you probably undoubtedly know, there are a lot of products now out there on the market that offer to train your brain. So brain games that you can do online or something that the hope is that that's going to help to help you age a little bit more gracefully. And although there is debate on the topic and some evidence that very extensive working memory training might help a little bit, I will say that the vast majority of evidence shows that training on brain games makes you better at brain games. So the real advantage is you get better at those tasks. It's not bad for you. I mean, if you have fun doing Sudoku or doing crossword puzzles, by all means. But the question is, does it transfer to other aspects of cognition? And the evidence for that kind of general transfer is much more limited. Okay, well, we are out of time, but thank you again for joining us this afternoon, and I hope you enjoyed the lecture.